Hey everyone, welcome back to Career Journeys brought to you by Career Companion. We're here with Ari today. He's going to give us an overview of what he's doing right now and how he got there. Ari, thank you so much for joining us.
No worries. Thank you so much for having me.
No problem. And so, for people out there, can you give us a rundown of your job title and what it consists of? And we were sort of chatting just before we started. You're actually transitioning into another role, so would love to get some insights into that as well.
Sure. So for what I'm doing now, my official title right now is an engineer two, with two eyes. The idea is that that's kind of like the software engineer that's right below a senior engineer role. So essentially, it's like engineer one, engineer two, senior engineer two, etc.
Yeah, wow.
Um,
Okay, lots of
and
levels.
so, yeah, lots of levels. And I'm going to be transitioning into, funnily enough, software engineer three at another company, which is their level just below senior engineers.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a bit confusing. It's a bit confusing when you go through it, but for my current responsibilities and things that I do, essentially think of me as, essentially the confusing part is I am a consultant, but also a software engineer. So my job is essentially to be somebody who can solve a problem, and solve a problem fairly quickly and in an ad hoc way. So if you think about a company, maybe they have a platform they want to build, they have a website they want to build, etc. And what they're trying to do, let's pretend they don't have the resources necessarily to hire a full team of people. They don't necessarily know how to solve a problem. So that's where I come in. So I look at it and I go, cool. I look at their infrastructure, I look at what they have, and I basically work with them to solve the problem that they want to solve. So that means using their code, their infrastructure, their methods of doing things, and kind of integrating all of that with their work. So it's not a traditional software engineering role. It's more like a generalist slash, yeah, it's more like a generalist role where you need to adapt very quickly to what
Yeah.
the client does. And that can mean anything. So that could be traditional software engineering. So I write code in pretty much any language that they want me to. So, your JavaScript, your Python, C Sharp, anything really that the client needs. And then being able to use their tools. So, for example, if you're using cloud systems like AWS, Azure, GCP, along with their infrastructure, and adapting to whatever other tools they might have. Um, so to give a very simple example, I worked with a bank that were looking to transfer their banking systems over. So I had to look at their infrastructure, I had to look at the banking system they want to go over, and then I just built a pipeline to move data between one and the other. And then essentially just set up a quick guide, sort of like documentation things to be like, this is how I would do it in future for future tools that they want to do. And essentially it's just helping their team. So I'd sit there with one of their engineers and I'd sort of coach them, to sort of be like, this is how you should think about this problem, this is what you should be doing, etc. Um, so it's a big role that has a lot to do with like communication and quick adaptation.
Yeah, and it sounds like you've got to be across a lot of different skill sets as well, especially with all those different languages. That must be very challenging going from one client in one language and then another client in another language.
Correct. It really challenges your ability to adapt and to find information. I've found that with those roles, it's not really useful to necessarily know a tool set 100%, but more that it's about your skills of being able to find out what you need to find out, which is a good thing and a bad thing, right? Like it's a double-edged sword. On one hand, you're not necessarily an expert at the tool itself, but you are an expert in the overarching idea of what you need to do. And so you kind of work together with a team of people to get to the answer that you need to get to.
Yeah.
Um,
That
that's what I'm
sounds
currently
very,
doing.
yeah, that sounds super, super interesting. Very difficult by the sounds of it. That new role that you're transitioning into, is it a similar one or completely different?
So the role that I'm transitioning into is a build and pipeline engineer, for a game development studio.
Awesome.
So they are a very different, they're a completely different beast to the game, to the company that I'm currently at. So essentially, if you think about a traditional video game and what needs to go into it, so you have like the game engine, which is what, you know, you use to create the game. You have a bunch of people who program the game itself, so they'll make sure a character walks across a screen. They'll make sure that things look nice. They'll make sure that there aren't a lot of bugs in the system, etc. And that's, generally what we call game development. However, outside of that, there is a whole other area that not a lot of people see and not a lot of people deal with, which is sort of like the infrastructure, what I call the software engineering side of things. You have the gameplay stuff, which is more, it's similar to what I'm doing in my current job, which is it's more ad hoc. You have to be able to adapt and you have to be able to sort of work with intuition with sort of what you're doing. Whereas the job that I'm going into now is once you have the game, how do you then make sure that it works for every single platform? So you're talking about iPad,
Yes.
iPhone, Android, Windows, Mac OS, Linux, PlayStation, Xbox, insert whatever platform you want. So how do you make sure that it builds and works on those? How do you make sure that it has been tested adequately? How do you make sure that it can be pushed into the right areas? So, for example, if you're releasing it on Steam or the PlayStation Store, good old games, whatever platform you need it to be on, how do you make sure that that happens in an automated way? But even more than that, it's also when somebody in the studio makes a change and they push that up into, your code repository, how do you then grab that, do a build, test it, but then do that concurrently with everyone else that's doing it as well, and then organize that data into ways that everyone can know what problems they have created and fix those. So it's a very different role to what I'm doing in this current job because it requires you, well, number one, it's more specific, so I'm not kind of moving between a lot of different things. It also requires you to be able to think about information. So it's like, what is information that people need? How do we get that to other people? If something breaks in the game, you need to be able to give that information to the person who broke the thing in a way that is helpful and informative. And you also need to be able to understand the requirements of every single platform. So, different platforms will have different requirements, different data sizes, different things they do. You need to be able to go into that. So, in many ways, it's a more specific role, but it's actually a far harder role than the current role that I'm doing now.
Yeah, yeah.
Mainly
You went
because,
when
yeah,
you explained the first role. I'm like, wow, this sounds very complex. And now and now I'm like, the next role is probably going to be, a bit. This sounds even more complex. Yeah.
it's very complex. Look, it's complex in a different way. It's complex in that the problem space that you're dealing with is very deep. The last job I was in, sorry, this job that I'm in is very wide. You need to know a lot of things. This one is very deep in that it
Yes.
goes very far down. Um, and obviously, you need to be able to do it quick as well. So that means you're also on call for these things. So, if a build breaks, I need to be able to fix it. A lot of people rely on you for it as well to get this stuff done because the gameplay developers don't really want to be dealing with that kind of stuff. And so you are the person they rely on to be an expert
Mm.
in these areas. It's a high responsibility role, um, which is quite scary, to be honest, as I'm
Yeah.
about to transition into it, but it's also a very rewarding one. If you get it right and if you do it well, it opens up a breadth of understanding that I think very few people get across their entire careers. So I'm very excited for it.
Yeah, no, it sounds super exciting, and like you said, the complexities of being, making sure that it works for every platform because there's not many game like there are still a lot of companies that do game exclusives. Nintendo being the main one, obviously, because
Hmm.
they're Nintendo, right? But like a lot more of that sort of Xbox, PC, PlayStation, even Call of Duty now doing mobile apps. Like a lot of it's, and that's the thing that I was going to ask as well. Are you then going to not only do you have to get them prepared for all those different platforms, but then a lot of them now do cross-platform play, so you need them to talk to each other as well. Are you part of that sort of structure as well?
So I'll be part of the testing structure on that. So essentially, when a release happens, that's for the QA people. I need to be able to get that to the QA people as quickly as possible. That comes down more to the actual gameplay things because that's networking code that goes into it.
Yeah.
But my part is going to be if something breaks on a specific platform that doesn't break on another one, I need to be able to understand what that is and go into it. So in a way, I'm going to be into it, but it's not going to be in the specific code. It's going to be in the understanding and being able to sort of debug across the different platforms.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot going on there.
Yeah, like, I'm just trying to think. I'm like, what would be easier if it broke on all platforms and you're like, it's just not working? Or, hey, why on earth is it working on these four but not this
Oh,
one? I think that would be more complicated because you're like, it should work because it works on all the others.
absolutely. Look, there's also things like if you have a different, you'll even have things breaking across the same platform. So, for example, you might have a Windows computer where a specific thing works, but it doesn't work on another Windows computer. And that comes down to hardware as well. So it's like this person has an AMD graphics card and this person has an NVIDIA graphics card. And the NVIDIA graphics card has this specific method of coding and this specific way of, dealing with graphics than this one does. And so you have to be able to account for the two of them. Which are issues that I've run into in the past when I've played around with 3D rendering and graphics. So these are all very big problems, which is why game engines exist, to be honest. Game engines tend to exist in order to deal with these problems, but they still can leak through
Mm.
at various times.
Yeah, look, I play like I guess what I play I would consider basic games. Like I'll play Nintendo, but I play Call of Duty with
Mm,
some of my friends online, and they had a recent thing a couple of weeks ago where they rolled out an update, and then so the mechanic in the game was you could sprint and you could reload at the same time. But then
mm,
when they rolled out the update, whenever you went to reload when sprinting, it would then just put you back to walking. And man,
mm-hmm.
the backlash on the internet from them towards the developers going, "You broke the game. What are you doing?" Rah, rah." It was crazy how just one little thing can change the whole actual gameplay. And I assume people in your position would have been like, "Okay, well, now we need to find out why."
Yeah, and look, I think that's where games get very difficult, in that it's harder to quantify a problem in a game than it is to do it in any other area of software. Actually, look, maybe AI and, simulation softwares probably can be a bit harder than games, but it's a question of like, how do you quantify fun? It's
Yeah,
like no one can go and put data as to what is fun and what is not fun. All you can do is find out what are people enjoying, right? But the reality is, people do a lot of things that are not fun, and they
yeah,
still put a lot of time into it. Like, fun and time spent doing something are not the same thing, and I think that's something which we get wrong a lot in the industry as well. But yes, like the moment something goes wrong, because people see games as an investment that they've put time into, and people really put their identities into games sometimes, it means that when you mess things up, they let you know, and they let you know with a vengeance.
yeah,
And sometimes it's very fair, right? Like sometimes really there are updates that should have never gone out, right, to a bunch of games. Sometimes, however, you can't really know until you put it out there, and sometimes you have
yeah.
deadlines and other things. It's a tough, tough situation.
Yeah,
Um,
and like you said, there's only so much that you can test, especially with a game that large. Like the amount of hours that it would take to test it, compared to if you put it live for 24 hours, with the amount of people who are actually actively playing, they're the testers for you. They'll find something, they'll break it within the 24 hours, and there's
yeah,
no way that you could have covered all of that as a business or an organization.
absolutely. And I think as well, it also comes down to how you present the product, right? I think this is a big thing that a lot of people also forget about, is that people can forgive bugs in a game, and people can forgive games not necessarily being entirely polished
Mm,
if they are presented the game in the correct format, right? Like I think that I don't know how much you know about games, but if you take something like Baldur's Gate 3 that came out
yes.
last year, right? That game was not in the best state when it came out.
Yeah.
Like I'm gonna put it out there. It was buggy, there was a lot of things. However, nobody's going out there being like, "Oh, you messed it up, you sold us a faulty product," etc., right? And it's because what they got was an incredibly good experience, which, yes, there were bugs in it, but no one felt shortchanged by it because of the amount of value that was in it to begin with.
Yeah.
So I think that games run into a very big challenge where it's like, especially in the bigger game studios, it's like you want to give a premium feel to people.
Yes.
And people are
Yes.
obsessed with this premium feel when the reality is that what people probably want is just something that's fun.
Yes.
And balancing the two is ridiculously hard.
Yeah. 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 No, I get you. I think. Yeah, I mean, a testament to that is one of the funnest games that me and my friends have played in the past couple of years would be Gang Beasts, which is probably the most basic looking game, but like you said, the core fundamentals, the mechanics, and all that sort of stuff is what makes it fun. But I think the most controversial one that I can think of that came out that was buggy and people were upset about was Cyberpunk. Like that
Yes.
was, but in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, obviously, I think it was due to the fact of the public just pushing them so much to release it, and then they got upset when they released it that it wasn't, that
Mm.
it was buggy and not complete. So, I guess it's a hard act for the gaming
Well,
industry.
well, there's two sides to it in that one of them is that when you overpromise, people get excited.
Yeah,
And when people get excited, they push and push and push, right? I think that we like to think that people are rational in the way that they think about things, when the reality is I think that once people get excited, it's hard to temper that excitement. So in Cyberpunk's case, if you think about all of the factors that were going against the studio, I mean, by the time they reached the release date, there was no way that they could have met the expectations of the players, right? I mean, you look at even the demos that they released. They released demos of like, yeah, look, here's hundreds of people walking down the street, and you've got this and that, and look at how realistic it is, and all these things. And you're sitting there, and you're just like, if you had just tempered these things down a little bit, just
mm,
stuck to basics, showed a bit more, I think it would have done a bit more to ease people's expectations. But when you've had a game that's being developed for years and people aren't seeing much from it, but you're promising things, people fill in the gaps. Which
yeah,
is why I
yeah,
think it's the same thing with anything in life, to be honest. Communication is key. And the problem with, I think, games is that in many cases you're selling a dream to people,
yeah,
right? Like, especially if there's no gameplay, you're selling a dream of like, here is a trailer, here's some things.
yeah,
Believe us when we say that this is what the game is. And
yeah,
people
yeah,
go, I believe you. Here's, in Australia, $110, right?
yeah,
I haven't even got the product yet. Here's money, right?
yeah,
And it's very easy, I think, to take that money and go, well, we basically paid for the game, you know?
yeah.
Not to say that that's what Cyberpunk did, but I think that when you pre-order things, it creates an expectation
Of
because
course.
you expect the game to be good. As opposed to if you didn't do that and you waited till after release and people looked at reviews and they saw that it wasn't good, you wouldn't get that much of a backlash. I think
Yes.
it's people view it as an investment rather than buying a product. And because of that, it's like, well, I paid $100. Why not getting the value? And it's like, well, you paid $100 for something that didn't exist.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, it's it's a weird balance between the two. I think audience and game developers, especially today, don't have a very healthy relationship with each other.
yeah,
I think it's what we call a parasocial relationship, where it's kind of like the relationship is kind of one way in that both
yeah.
sides think that they know each other and they're like personal with each other when the reality is it's not really that way, right?
Yeah, yeah. No, that makes sense. And I guess, look, a lot of people are going to be interested in your role and what you're stepping into. So let's rewind all the way back. And I asked my favorite question was, let's rewind to high school. Did you know what you wanted to do, and did you go, "Yep, I'm going to be a game developer"?
Absolutely not. When I was in high school, I was I went to my teacher, my math teacher, and I was like, I'm never going to use math in my life. I
Okay.
went to
Yeah.
him and I
Yeah.
was like, I'm going to be a lawyer. I was a humanities student. So I did 4 unit English. If I'm not, are you from Sydney? I don't know if the
Yes.
people
Yeah.
who are
Yeah. Yeah.
outside, yeah, I don't know
Yes.
if the
Yes.
people who are outside of New South Wales will know what that is, but essentially, For the people who don't know what that is, it's essentially you spend the year in school kind of basically making a short story is
Yes.
what it is, right? So you spend the time building it, you go through a diary, you have like a full design diary that you go through iterations, etc. So I was really into my writing at the time. I mean, I did history, I did like legal studies, all that stuff, and I was like, I'm not going to touch math. I'm going to be a historian, academic, politician. I don't know what I'm going to be, but I'm not going to touch math.
Yeah.
Um, and you can imagine a few years later, I saw that same math teacher at a reunion, and I was like, you'll never guess what happened to me. And when I told him, he just started laughing. But I had no idea. Like, I was very, obviously I liked games, I liked my stories, I liked all of those things when I was a kid, when I was in high school. But if you had told me that I would be dealing with code and I'd be on my computer dealing with code and, touching that kind of stuff, I would, I would not believe you. Like the thought
Yeah.
even that it would be possible for me to solve, to know what a matrix was.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah.
Um, so it's a big irony that I end up going into game development. Yeah, it was mostly after school when I looked at my HSC. I still got a good HSC, but it wasn't good enough to get into law.
Mm.
I got my ATAR back, and I was looking at it. My sister's like, "Why don't you just try game development?" And I was like, "No, you need to know linear algebra. I don't even know what linear algebra is." Um,
Yeah, because that
and,
was going to be my next question was what did you do after high school? Did you go into uni? But no, continue with this story. That's great. You've already answered a lot of my questions. So this is good. It's just like a story time for me. I love it. Keep going.
Yeah, well, I took a year off school. I took a year of school after school and just went to study overseas, and then got back.
Sorry, what did you study when you were overseas?
Yes, this is going to be a very culturally specific thing, but there's
Yeah.
a thing called yeshiva that
Okay.
is in the. Essentially, I grew up in a religious Jewish community, and
Hmm.
essentially what yeshiva is that it's kind of like university, but for religious studies of things. So
Oh, cool.
you go and it's kind of like a boarding school. So you go in, you get like a room and you share it with like two other people and you wake up early, you pray, and then you learn pretty much the whole day. So it's like you'll sit there and you'll study like, you know, Old Testament, and then you've got like what's called the Gemara, which is essentially like court notes from very court notes from like the 500s
Oh,
AD,
wow. Okay. Yeah.
which should basically go over like, here is a statement in Jewish law. What does it mean? What are the boundaries? And so it's basically like it's an ancient kind of problem-solving text, if you think about it, of just people debating different laws and things. But people, in our culture, it's very important because it's the idea of like, our laws and our ideas have always been something that change and which are about a back and forth discussion. So it's a lot of problem
Mm.
solving. How high does this need to be? How low does it have to be? This is why I make the joke to people that, this religion is one of the most highly regulated religions on the planet because it's like, oh, how high can this thing be? Well, it says it needs to be noticeable. So that is like 2 meters. And it's like, but what if it's down below here? What if it's like 5 centimeters? Is that noticeable? And it's like, no, and it's kind of like back and forth. And so it was like a year of doing a lot of very specific study,
Yeah.
on that. And it was very good. Like, I don't regret going there. It was very intense though. It's like,
Mm.
you're literally going from like 7 a.m. till 9 p.m. most
Wow.
days.
Yeah.
Um, and so you don't have a lot of time to yourself. You're sort of like in this place with a bunch of other young boys out of school. So you can imagine it's like the rooms were like covered in laundry and
Yeah.
dirty and all that
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah. Yeah.
I find I was looking at it very fondly. I'm just like, man, what a lifestyle I used to live
Yeah.
in
How
this
wild.
place. But that's why you look at it, you look back at it because it's very funny. If people today saw, like, could think about that of me, they'd be like, what do you mean? He's like a professional. He wears, like, goes into the office and he talks to like clients and all that stuff. And I'm like, yeah, I also like, for fun, got a goldfish and had it in my room in that time,
Yeah. Yeah.
like it's a very funny thing. But either way, so then I got back and essentially, I had to work out what I wanted to do. And so
Yeah.
I applied for this game development degree at University of Technology, Sydney. It was a fairly new degree as well, at the time. And so, first time went in, and it was a shock because strangely enough, I was very good at a lot of the things that I had to learn. And what I found that was very astonishing was that if I wanted to learn something, I could do it. Which I think when you're in high school, you don't really understand, mainly because the HSC kind of pigeonholes you, right? It goes,
Yes.
these are the math people, these are the humanities people, these are the arts people, whatever, right? You got
Yeah.
this stuff, and I think when you come out of high school, you tend to think, this is who I am. I'm
Mm.
only ever going to be this person. I'm only ever going to be that person. And look, in truth, am I still an expert at math? No, not really. I can use the math that I need to use for the job, but that's kind of the point, right? It's going back to that idea of being able to find things. I think in high school you rely a lot on your memory, whereas a lot later you start to realize that memory isn't the most important thing in the modern world because there's too much to remember.
Yes.
So being able to find things is the most important skill once you go into university. So for me, it was like I started off with the most simple math. It was binary math, right? It's like, you got a zero and a one, you want to add a one to it. Where does it go? Okay, then where does it go from there? And, how do you add two binary numbers to each other, etc. And obviously at the time, I wasn't really fully trained to think mathematically, so it was very difficult for me. And then fast forward later, it's like you then get to game math, and it's like, okay, you've got a position of, a character, and it's like, okay, and then you have a vector that shows the direction of this person, but then you have to add force to this thing, and it's this process of like, at the time I was like, what's a vector? Like I literally
Yes.
I didn't know what a
Yeah.
vector was. I didn't
Yeah.
know how force worked. I didn't really understand how any of the things worked, but I had to work it out. And so, I'd sit there and I'd like look at things, and eventually I found that you build an intuition for it, as things happen. And so, but I'm not going to lie, it was very difficult.
Mm.
It's difficult to change your mode of thinking and your way of thinking about the world.
Yeah.
Going from something that's very academic to something that's very practical and visual is a huge leap. And in many ways, I'm still going through that transition even in my current life. I kind of had to build up a lot of skills and just learn that stuff on the fly, but also be comfortable with the idea that I won't necessarily understand everything until I put more work into it as well.
Mm.
And that kind of led me down the next part of my path, which was, I was working on some games with some friends, and what I found was, in many ways, I didn't know what I was doing, right?
Mm.
I
And
knew that if you, yep, go
sorry,
on.
was this concurrent while still studying that you then started to go, okay, well, this is actually really cool. We're learning some stuff. Let's put it into
Correct.
a practical use. Cool. All right, perfect. Sorry, I was just trying to
Correct.
paint that picture.
Yeah, all good. Sorry, I'm just rambling
No,
random
no,
stuff
it's
that's
great.
coming. I'm just saying whatever's coming to my head, so
No, no, no. It's
you
but
can.
this is the career journey. So no, it's perfect.
Yeah, well, so at the end of my degree, you had a thing called the Game Studio 1, Game Studio 2, which is essentially in the semester you create a game. Um, and you do it with a group of people. And essentially what I found going through it was that it was a very rewarding experience. So you come out with like a very small idea of a game with other people, but when you go through that, you realize there's a lot of rough edges to these things that you're creating, but also you don't necessarily know how to solve them. So,
Mm.
for example, I was using Unity at the time. That was the game engine that the degree used primarily. And Unity had two ways of moving a character. One of them was by just going, where's the position of this character? Change it to this position, or add this much force to this thing. The other one was a physics system. So it's like, add force, this much in this direction. And that's using the physics system. So one is using math, well, pure math in that here's a vector position, put it here. The other one is add force, which goes whoosh, right? It's like, it doesn't change you there. It just kind of goes in a very natural kind of like dragging motion across the screen. And what I found was I was terrified to deal with the physics because I didn't know what they did. Like,
Yeah.
I didn't understand them. I didn't know what was going on. Um, and I found that in many ways it was holding me back because I just didn't. There were too many things that I was too uncertain about. It was like, if I want to make a bullet move across the screen, how do I make that work? Well, here's the basic pattern of how to do it if you look at online. But it's like, but why? Why is that the case?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so that led me to then approaching my professor, and I just went, look, I would like to learn how a game engine works. Um, and at the time he was telling me like, no, don't bother. They already exist. Don't reinvent the wheel. Um, and I resisted, and I basically went like, look, I would like to learn how it works. Is there any way that I could spend a semester doing that? And at the time at UTS, they had a subject that was known as like directed study, which was essentially if you get a sponsor in the faculty, a professor, to essentially sponsor you to do research, you can get a semester where you do research, then you write a paper about it.
Ah,
And
cool.
essentially you come out with that. So the agreement we came to was that I would spend the semester kind of experimenting with writing a game engine. But of course, because it had to be experimental, I had to do it in the non-traditional way. So that led me to try it in Rust, which was a fairly new programming language at the time. And so I spent a full year working on that. It was a disaster. It did not go well. I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't
Yeah.
understand it. I mean, it's still on my GitHub to this day, and I always tell people, like, don't look at it. Don't look at that. I'm ashamed of that repository. But in many ways, it opened in me a new understanding and a new desire to understand
Yeah.
how these things work. And so by the time I finished university, pretty much I'd finished that task, and I'd also kind of had that game engine or that attempt at a game engine in my back pocket. But the big issue that happened was that at the time, we were studying Unity engine. At the time, Unreal Engine was starting to become far, far more popular in the gaming industry. And what ended up happening was I'd come out of university and I discovered that I had skills in game development, but no one wanted to hire me,
Right.
um,
Okay.
which was really, really difficult at the time, especially since the gaming industry in Australia is very, very small. It's tiny,
Mm.
and you don't really have a lot of options for what you want to do because a lot of them, once they have their staff, they generally keep them. They don't pay particularly well either, and they would rather hire from the games industry than hire from outside of it.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of barriers to entry into the workforce at the time. So at that period of time, I didn't quite know how to do it. I tried multiple interviews. I failed all of them, mainly because, again, like I came out of it, and you get to these interviews where they're like, all right, here's a link to HackerRank with some random coding question. Go solve that. And obviously, I didn't know what I was doing. So, I'd go there, I'd try it, and then people would be like, oh, just go on Leet Code. Go on Leet Code, answer a bunch of questions on that, which I tried, and I found very quickly that it was a very unsatisfying experience. I mean,
Yeah.
it basically felt like I was going back to the HSC. If I was to reflect back on the HSC, I think my biggest critique of it is that in the HSC, people would go to me and they would say, here is an essay format. That is the essay format that HSC markers are looking for. So if you use this, you'll get a 90, you'll get in the top band. And that felt like what these lead code things were doing, is that they were saying, this is the method with which you can succeed. This
Yeah.
is the only way you can succeed in the tech industry. And I found that to be very unsatisfying at the time, and very frustrating. I spent some time kind of looking for. In between that time, I'd done some odd work around there. So I had an internship at a VR company that at the time was in Parramatta. Um, so I trekked all the way there. I spent 2 months with them, which was a very difficult experience, but it was very good as well.
Mm.
Um,
And sorry,
then,
just
yep.
on that, because obviously you said there was a really hard barrier to entry and all that. How did you eventually get that first internship? What did you do differently to, I guess, get in there?
So I was actually quite lucky with that one. I mean, to be honest, I have a pattern where I tend to attribute a lot of things to luck, so
Yeah.
maybe that's just my own bias coming in here. But essentially, what we used to have at the end of each semester was a showcase. So it'd be a games showcase where the games that you made would be shown to other people. And at the time, sort of, I was in this showcase. I had a demo that I'd put up, and that demo was a demo for an AI. So I built an AI for a guy in the middle of a screen who would patrol around, and if he saw the player, he would chase the player. And I had a partner with me who helped me make, well, not help me. He was in the same assignment with me, and he was working on kind of like a turn-based system, like a turn-based combat and customization system. So we had this very basic demo, and I was showing it off at this expo, at this thing, and no one was interested in what I was showing. Like literally, no one was interested. They were going past. They were like, "Oh, that's cool. It's a guy who chases people." Because I guess from their perspective, we're so spoiled today, right? Like,
Yeah.
you look at a game and you see all this realistic stuff, and then a guy goes to you and says, "Look, I'm so proud. I got a guy to patrol around a room." You'll be like, "Well, that's not impressive." Because you don't know. You don't know the work that goes behind it.
Yeah.
So, I was quite frustrated at the time. And so another friend of mine comes, pretty much it's a ghost town around my area. And, I have a chat with this friend of mine, and I go to a completely different project that I built. And that was, I made a basic kind of like, if you know StarCraft or Warcraft 3 or any of those games, I made a basic
Yeah.
2D demo of that, of like characters that could find their way across a map.
Yeah. From the bird's eye
Um,
view, right?
exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes. Like Age of Empires sort of stuff. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly that.
Sorry, that's showing my age.
I love Age of Empires, so don't
Yeah.
worry,
Yeah.
you're in good company. But essentially, what ended up happening was a random guy approached me, and he was like, "What's this?" And I was like, "Oh, this is my side project that I've done. I wrote a small paper on it. Blah blah blah." He starts asking me questions, and he starts like going into details and really grilling me on it. And eventually, we're having a chat. Everyone in the room goes off to the award room, and the two of us are just chatting. And then eventually, by the end of it, the guy just turns to me and says, "All right, well, here's my business card. We would love to have you as an intern."
Awesome.
Like, so this is to the VR place, which was very lucky. Like again, it wasn't even for the project that I would have thought would have gotten me that. There was no glory to that project. It wasn't a sexy project, right? Like
Yeah.
it wasn't particularly glamorous. Later on, when I spoke to the guy, he essentially said to me, "Look, I was impressed by the fact that you were interested enough to do your own things in the background and look into complex parts of software and game development, which I appreciated." And to be honest, that internship was very influential to why I started going into the game engine stuff as well. And that's mainly because at the time, like, I was not very good in that internship, to be very blunt. Like, I struggled a lot. They got me to do a feature, and I just was not prepared for that feature. Like, I was struggling to work with their infrastructure. I didn't know how networking worked in games. I couldn't quite get the shaders right or the things right, and they were very patient and they worked very well with me throughout that. But when I spoke to them afterwards and I said, what can I actually do? One of the things they said to me was, "You need to understand what you're doing, right? You can do things and we can see that you can do things, but the path to mastery isn't just in doing things, it's in knowing what it is that you are doing." And that struck a chord with me because they were right. I spent all of that time fumbling around, not really knowing, not really being sure if what I was doing was correct. And I did it because people told me, "Well, you don't have to. You don't have to know, right? You just have to, as long as it works, it works." Um, and so for me, it was kind of a really big thing where I just had to sit there and work out, oh, like, what do I do like, how do I build up my mastery of this thing? So that started my journey in the game engine part of things. After that, I had a small internship. Not internship, I actually had a job by my university
Oh,
to help the
awesome.
quantum computing department make a game. So they wanted to create a game that actually taught people or showed people, students who want to understand quantum, gave them a basic understanding of what it was. And that was also a very difficult project because essentially I don't know if you've dealt with professors who are very mathematical, but they don't really understand that other people don't know math. So you go
Yeah.
to them and you're like, can you explain entanglement to me? And they're like, well, and get the board up, and it's like, well, you see, here's a whole equation, linear algebra, blah, blah. Here's a bunch of symbols you don't understand. And I was like, okay,
Yeah.
I need to do some work. So I had 3 weeks to do it, and I basically had to teach myself linear algebra and the math of quantum computing within that time, which was a very difficult thing. I did come out with a demo by the end, but it took a lot. Like, it was
Yeah.
very stressful at the time. But that also taught me a very valuable lesson about being able to adapt, right? Again, you're talking about someone who has never really done complex math in his life. And then you've taken this person, you've given them a deadline, and you've said, okay, this is what you need to do. And by the end of it, I knew the math. I could take a notebook out, I could problem solve a basic quantum circuit, right? And I made a game about that as well. So it was a huge learning curve, but I made it out at the end. And obviously, they were very grateful. It didn't end up going anywhere, this project, unfortunately, but for me, it was a very big learning curve and a very big learning moment in terms of where my career can take me. But shortly after that, a friend of mine who was at not a startup, but at basically a company, a software engineering company reached out and said, look, we're hiring right now. I think you'd be very good at it. I want to put your name through. And
Okay.
at the
And that
time,
that was
going,
a
yep,
sorry, that was a friend of yours, right?
correct.
Seems like your network has helped quite a lot leading up to this point, which is something that we always recommend is, always work on your network, and this is a prime example. Sorry, I just wanted to double check
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that
Yeah.
was it. Keep going.
Well, what I want to say on that is that I also think that when it comes to networking, you have to be careful. And that is that a lot of people like to use buzzwords and think that networking is. You don't want to be a slimy person who goes up to somebody who makes a lot of money and go, I really like you. You're so
Oh yeah.
smart. You're so this, you're so that. And try to work your way in. I mean, this guy, I didn't even know there would be an opportunity with him. So
Mm,
he and I actually met the previous year at a bouldering gym. So we were bouldering,
okay.
and a friend of mine brings him in, and we start chatting. And the next thing you know, my friend and his brother go off, and they basically bouldered the whole time. And me and this guy have just been sitting on a couch talking. And after that, we essentially just became very close. Like, we started chatting a lot, we started talking. We butted heads often, right? We would disagree a lot on things, but we had a very healthy respect for each other. And so by the time I was looking for a job, he had basically had me in mind that entire time. But there was never a conscious effort to get a job out of him. It
Yeah.
was something that fell into place. And I think that's what I like to say about networking is that if you just be a decent person, things will
Yes.
follow. But beside that point, so he recommended me to this job. I got referred, had a chat with the director. Director liked me, went through the whole interview process. Had to do a take home test, which was very good. I did quite well in that one. A bunch of culture tests. The next thing I knew, I got my first full-time job ever
Awesome.
it was a very big moment. And to be honest, that job really changed my outlook on work as well. I mean, it was a fun place to work in. It was very new, very young, very generous as well. So it was a US-based company. They flew me out to New York for the training and,
Wow.
you know, very generous. I mean, I'd still look to that company to this day as a model for how I think every company should run.
Okay.
People enjoyed working there and the
Yeah.
team was close. I still keep contact with many people from that company to this day. But the work itself was not that satisfying to me in that it was basically a customer support role, but for technical people. So
Yes.
my job was, I was on an email, people would send questions, I would answer them. But that was also part of that learning curve, right? Of you don't know the answer, but you have to find out. And
Yeah.
so It's basically my days would be spent digging through documentation, experimenting, trying to get the things that need to be done right. And you're talking big software engineers, right? Would be reaching out. So they would have these big questions, like big scientific or mathematical questions, and you kind of just you were expected to know, right? And so that was a huge learning curve in terms of writing style, in terms of communication styles, and of course technical skills. I mean, at the time, I didn't really know how cloud providers worked. I didn't know how
Yeah.
containers worked. I didn't know how a lot of things in software engineering worked. Because I was a game developer. I could move a guy across the screen, I could make a gun shoot something, but if you asked me to put a server together in AWS, I couldn't do that to save my life, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that job went for a year. Um, Shortly after that, another friend of mine reached out to me, a role that he was in for a consulting firm. That consulting firm was looking, they were just, he had basically, they'd opened up their gates to say, look, we're looking for people who are less experienced because we want to give them opportunities. And my friend sent my resume in. Next thing I know, I'm getting a really lovely recruiter reaching out to me. At the same time, I was looking for a job elsewhere. I had another set of interviews going on. And essentially, I ended up in a point where I was given two job offers from each one. I had to choose, and I ended up going with the consulting job. So again, the guy who referred me to that one, I'd only met him the previous year, and I only met him because we started doing what's called a game jam together. So game
Okay.
jam is you essentially give yourself like 24 to 48 hours, and you just make a game in that time. So you have to
Oh,
very quickly
cool.
ideate, very quickly
Yeah.
work on something. And this guy was a good friend of another friend of mine, and we just got to know each other, right? And he recommended me, and I got into this consultancy. Now, this consultancy was a boutique. It was a
Yep.
very, very small company. But at the time, there was a bit of a rush and a bit of an excitement going on about it, and I didn't quite know what it was. And, the director, the co-founder was going to me and he was like, this is an opportunity of a lifetime. And I was like, what do you mean? It's just a job. Like, what do you mean
Yeah.
opportunity of a
Yeah.
lifetime? A few days later, I get notified that they were acquired by an even larger consultancy.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
And so my job went from being in a boutique company to suddenly being a consultant for one of the big four, um, which is a very funny story because again, people look at you with names like the names I have in my resume, and they're like, "Oh my God, you must be so smart." And it's like, I mean, the reality is when you are somebody who has just come out of university and you don't have a lot of skills, it's more about are you somebody that people can have faith in
Yeah.
and people can trust. And that I believe in very strongly. I don't think a lot of recruiters, when they speak to you, are really looking for skills because skills can always be changed and skills
Yes.
can always be developed. I think what they're looking for is this somebody who I can trust and is this somebody who I can put my faith in for the
Yeah.
future? And I do believe that very, very strongly across all the jobs. Like, obviously, in software engineering, there are a lot of places which will ask you to do technical tests and all that stuff, right? But those are all screening things. No one is really looking, no one really cares how quickly you can invert a binary tree or solve some random obscure coding problem. The crux of where your employment will come down to is, are you somebody who they enjoy speaking to? Um, because ultimately that's what work is. Your job is never going to be just you by yourself. It's going to be a lot of people with conflicting interests and different personalities. And if you're not capable of getting along with them or making them feel comfortable around you, then most likely you're not going to get that job, right? So that was another lesson that I learned going into this consultancy was for a long time I had imposter syndrome going into it where I really felt I didn't deserve the job. Because I got lucky, right? It was like, oh, a friend and this and that, and people were trying to constantly remind me, oh, you are competent, you do deserve this
Yeah.
job, etc. But it's a very hard pill to swallow because obviously people spend a lot of time trying to get into these companies, right? They'll go through multiple tests, multiple interviews, etc. And that's when I also came to realize that there really is a power in being the smartest person in the room is not the most important thing,
Yeah.
right? Being the most intelligent person on the planet is not the most important thing. It it really is just about, are you, part of life comes down to, obviously, right place, right time always comes into account. But at the same time, the right place and the right time don't actually happen unless you put in the effort to make those things happen sometimes. And you can't predict it, but you can set yourself up in ways that there are seeds that will eventually bloom
Mm.
into something else. And the reason why I say that is because at this point in time, I'd given up on the gaming industry. I didn't think that I would ever get back into games. I gave up on the gaming industry because at that point I'd sent applications out. No one even looked at my resume at the time. Working in software engineering was not working in my favor. And I was actually quite downhearted for a very long time because even with the game engine stuff, so, you know, in between my first job and this job, I'd basically made three more game engines. Right, and I'd failed horribly with most of them, except for the last one, Siege Engine, which is a project that I still work on to this day. Um, and I thought to myself that this was setting myself up for the long term, right? Like being somebody who can do these things and deal with these skills will help me. And I knew it, right? But the world didn't seem to be rewarding me for it, right? Which is usually what happens with long-term investments, right? You don't see
Yeah.
much benefit from it. And what ended up happening was I actually had a bit of a real breakdown last year over it because I went to a gaming conference, started speaking with people, and people were encouraging me, but they were like, "Look, we're looking for people who are very, very experienced. We're not looking for somebody who's just put together a game engine on the fly, right?"
Mm.
Um, and at the time, like, I remember I came out of this conference and I spoke to a friend. I was like, my last 4 years have been wasted. Like, I just went, like, I threw away my life, I threw away my passions, I sold myself to a consultancy, and this is all I'll ever be. And it was really difficult. It was a really difficult time because I completely lost faith in myself and in my skills. And that kept going pretty much until this year. So this year, it started off very difficult I started off in a very difficult place. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I knew that I didn't want to be a consultant anymore, and I started looking for a new role, but just nothing was working. My mindset wasn't in the right place. I kept getting jobs where people would ask me to solve those lead code questions, and at some point I just resigned myself and just went, you know what, I'm just going to have to stop what I'm doing and just spend a month just doing nothing but solving programming problems because I'm not getting through screening processes. Nobody wants to talk to me, and it just felt awful. Like, especially this year, we all know that there's been problems with, finding jobs for a lot of people, right?
Yes.
Especially at that point, I'd been 4 years into my career, which meant that not, I didn't have enough tenure to be a senior engineer, but I didn't have enough for that, but all the roles were senior engineers. So it was almost impossible to even get seen by a lot of places. That was until I got a message from another friend of mine, who had joined this gaming company. And essentially what ended up happening was has he had essentially, in this gaming company, he'd sent in my resume a few times and they told him no. Right? They said, no, we're not hiring this person. He doesn't have experience. He doesn't have this. He doesn't have that. Or they said to me, if we do hire him, then he'll be as a junior. And,
Right.
at
Yeah.
that time, a junior role was like 60K,
I
right?
was going to say,
60K
yeah,
job.
from a money point of that would not be viable.
Correct. It was impossible. I wouldn't have taken the role, and I also felt really frustrated at the time because I talked to people and I'd say, that's a pathetic salary, right? They'll go and they'd say, well, most people do it for the passion. I was like, you can't live on passion,
Passion doesn't pay
especially when,
your rent.
exactly. But a unique opportunity had opened up in their job, and that, they started doing a bunch of, basically, for one reason or another, a lot of people resigned, moving to other places, or, new stages in life. Opportunities started opening up, and essentially, my friend said, new management came in. And my friend just went and he gave my resume to the team and just said, please look at this. And at first they ignored it. We're like, no, unless he has 10 plus years of experience, we don't want him.
Yeah.
But then the new tech lead looked at my resume, went to the recruitment team and just said, I want you to call this guy. So I was very depressed when I get the message from them. And, we start chatting. They arrange the interview. I have a chat with the recruiter. I have a chat with the team. We go through the interview. It's a very intense interview. It's an interview that I loved, though. It was one which was basically, give me a brain dump. Just how would you solve this problem? And I basically
Yes.
just had to go step by step, what I would do, what my considerations are. There were questions back and forth, etc. And that went for around an hour and a half. And came out of it, very tired, didn't know what was going on. And a few days later, the recruiter reaches out and says to me, no, I want to have a meeting with you about the feedback from your role, from the review. And, when a recruiter tells you that they want to give you feedback, I generally associate that with, you didn't
Bad
make
news.
it,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
we want to
yeah.
tell you why, right? It's
Yes.
like, you didn't make it, but we like you enough that we want to tell you why and hopefully help you for a future thing, right?
Yeah, which is always nice and what you would
Oh,
hope
yeah,
for out of
absolutely.
any interview process. It should be a given. Yeah.
Absolutely. No issues there. But I was really down when I got that. I was like,
Yeah.
oh, I failed. I can't believe this. I let my friend down, all of that. We get into the meeting. The recruiter asks me, hey, so how do you think you did? I was like, I think I did pretty well. I answered truthfully, did this, did that. And he just goes, yeah, look, we have nothing bad to say about you. We want to give you an offer.
And you're
And
like, what? Oh, yes.
oh, I was completely taken aback. I was like, what?
Yeah.
What do you mean? What
Yeah.
do you mean you want to give me an offer? I'm so confused.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like when the doctor calls you up and they're like with blood test results or something, and you're like, hey, we just need you to come in and deliver the news. And you're like, oh no, and you get in there, they're like, yes, everything's good. And you're like,
Yeah,
why
yeah.
did you cause me all this stress?
Well, correct. And essentially, that's where I'm at now, right? So,
Amazing.
the offers come through. We're looking, we're still at the negotiating stage, but pretty much it's a done deal, right? And I think back on it and I go like, geez, that was a long-winded way to get into this industry, and obviously to be going in it in a role that isn't necessarily entirely doing the game. Some people would look at that and be like, well, it's not necessarily in games, etc. But I look at it and I go, the role that I've gone into is actually a very big role that requires a lot of trust and a lot of faith, right?
Yeah.
And in many ways, I look at that and I go, I'm kind of glad that this is the role I got. Like, I'm kind of glad that I've been entrusted with a position where what I will be doing is incredibly impactful and important to getting something out there, right? And it leverages the skills that I've built up over time very well. But going back to the idea of the long-term investment, right? Like those game engines that I built, those things that I did, I had to make sure that those games were working for Windows, Mac OS, and Linux, right? So I had
Yeah.
already started experimenting with automated builds for all of those things and being able to debug them and understand how those platforms work. You know, building C++ skills, understanding how game engines work, understanding how rendering works, etc. All of those skills are what played into my favor in this specific situation. Now, obviously, there's luck in the fact that the position even was available in the first place, right? Generally, when a position like this opens up, they will find someone and then they will try to hold on to him for as long as possible.
Yeah.
And the person who I'm replacing has been there for a very long time, right?
Yeah.
So it's big shoes to fill, and obviously there is an element of luck to that. However, again, did I ever think that this friend of mine who works at this company would be the reason why I got into a game development company? No, I never would have thought that would be. the case, right? I never thought that would even be possible in the
Mm.
first place. Um, and I guess in some ways, it does show the fact that spending time building up a passion or building up the work that you want to do and keeping in mind that there is a reason why you do it is important in of itself, right?
Yeah.
It's knowing the stuff, right? Like I've been in tech now 4 years, and the amount of times people have gone to me and have said to me, "Hey, you need to get a certification. If you don't get a certification, how can anyone know that you can spin up a server in AWS?" And it's like, because I can just spin up a server in AWS, right? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
why do I need a piece of paper that can say that I can do that, right? In the same way that people will say you have to solve leet code problems, and it's like, well, why do I need to solve an obscure problem to prove to someone that I can code, right? Or that I can solve a problem? And I guess in reality there are a lot of ways that you can get to a career that you want to get to. The method that I took was, I mean, it took longer, right?
Yeah.
If I had, to be honest, if I had just spent the time going in, solving those problems, jumping into those big game engines that everyone's using and doing all of that stuff, maybe I could have gotten in a lot earlier. Like, there's a very big possibility that I could have. But I look back at it and I go, but at least I've had a chance. And this is, going back to the idea of the other two jobs and the other things that I've done. I'm very grateful for the fact that I've had the opportunity to build up a holistic view of what the work is that I do, right? And I think that's also what played into my favor with this job, in that they didn't want somebody who only does game development. They wanted somebody who also could bring in other perspectives and other ways of working into that. And so, yeah, I mean, that's the whole story, really.
That's
Uh,
great. Very interesting. And look, sorry you went through some bad times at the end there, but you persevered, you're resilient, you kept going, which just shows that if you just keep going with your passion and, like you said, building up on the side, then I wouldn't say it's luck. By the sounds of your whole career journey, you've created the situations that have led to a sprinkle of luck. Yeah, like you said, it can always be right place, right time, but you could be the right place at the right time, but you could have not done everything that you had done, and you would be the wrong person. Like, it sounds like through a lot of the stuff that you've done, like I'm a big believer in it as well. Like, try something, and if you fail at it, that's fine, as long as you're taking the learnings from that failure into the next thing that you're doing. And by the sounds of it, that's what your new company and the new employers have seen in you and said, look, he's not afraid to give something a go, learn from it, and then make the next thing he's working on even better. And by the sounds of it, that's what's made them go, this is the person that we want. So, look,
mm,
fantastic career journey. I think it was amazing, and I'm very conscious of your time. So, thank you so much for taking the time to do that. It was great chatting with you, and look forward to following your career journey into the new role.
Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing how this platform progresses. I mean, it'll be
Yeah.
very exciting to see other people's testimonies as well.